Good morning. I hope you're all joining us. I'll just wait a few more seconds for people to come in. But good morning, everyone. I think we'll make a start. We are going to be pressed for time. We have 1 hour, so I think we'll start on time. And if anyone else joins us, they'll come in at a later time. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Countryside COP Week. My name is Paul Billings, and I will chair the first part of our workshop today. It is important that I tell you that this workshop is being recorded and that we will be reviewing the recording at a later date in order to draw our conclusions. Countryside COP2 is organised by the CFE, championing the farmed environment. This is a partnership of agricultural, environmental and governmental bodies promoting good environmental management through productive farming practices. Now in its second year, Countryside COP provides a workshop platform for anyone interested in the countryside and wishing to influence how the UK's rural economy and agriculture can help tackle climate change and improve sustainability. The aim of these workshops is to discuss specific subjects in depth and produce 3 to 5 key messages to drive implementation. The key messages from each event will then be collated by the Countryside COP Secretariat into an outcome document of recommendations and actions for policymakers, the industry, researchers, the supply chain and investors. This workshop, one of 16 taking place, is entitled Net Zero from Productive Grassland. We have 2 expert and particularly well qualified speakers for you, one of whom will cover forage grasses and 1 forage legumes. They will be followed by my co-host, Dr. Christina Marley, who will coordinate ideas and responses from you. We will then feed these back to the CFE and ultimately the policymakers who will represent the UK at COP27 in Egypt. There are 3 ways you can interact with us today. The Q&A box. Please put in here ideas that you have for achieving net zero from productive grasslands and also use this for questions to our speakers. An online survey. This will be run by Christina towards the end of our session. You will need to use Vvox for this and will need a mobile device handy. You do not need to download the app and can complete the survey from their website. Christina will give you joining instructions later. To close the session, we will create a live word cloud to share with you. We will ask you to sum up what changes grassland agriculture can make to achieve net zero whilst remaining productive. But bear in mind, you will need to answer this in just 20 characters. So why net zero from productive grasslands? In and of itself, grassland is a carbon sink. Negative zero in emissions terms, but it's what we apply to grasslands to make them grow and then how we convert grasslands into human foods that creates emissions. These currently outweigh the ability of grasslands to capture carbon, and that is the problem that we must resolve. Grassland covers 2/3 of UK agricultural land. In England alone, 3.9 million hectares of temporary grass and improved permanent pasture across 60,000 grassland farms. It can offer amazing biodiversity and habitat for wildlife. It sustains many rural communities. 30% of all agricultural workers are employed on grazing livestock farms. Grassland and the soils it grows from are the UK's biggest carbon sink, and it forms the rolling hills of William Blake's Green and Pleasant Land, or, if you prefer, Tom Jones's green grass of home. And of course, you can produce from it what I personally believe are fantastic animal proteins, red meat and dairy products. Indeed, the UK grassland is the key component in dairy and red meat production. It is the major energy source for dairy, 55% of their requirement, lamb 95% and beef 75%, feeding the UK's 9.6 million cattle and calves and 33 million sheep and lambs. The dairy and red meat industry is significant. In 2020 alone, UK dairy farms produced 15.3 billion litres of milk with a wholesale value of £9.2 billion. UK beef and sheep meat value exceeded £14.5 billion, and together they employed over 224,000 staff in farming and processing. But livestock farming must change to produce more food, but at the same time achieve net zero. This will require significant and new farming practices, and we will look at some of the ideas for that today. Our first speaker on this topic is Dr. David Lloyd. David is head of plant breeding for Germinal and is responsible for running a team of 15 plant breeders and technicians embedded at Aberystwyth University. David's team breed forage grasses and legumes for temperate climates around the globe. Before working for Germinal, David led the public good forage legume and pulse breeding programs at Aberystwyth University. His plant breeding has led to numerous legume varieties which have been successfully placed on national and recommended lists and taken up by farmers. He has acted as a principal investigator on a number of UKRI and EU funded research projects. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for a very thorough introduction. I'm going to be talking about some of the innovative forage legume breeding work that we at Germinal have been carrying out to help the ruminant livestock industry move towards net zero. Our breeding programs based at Aberystwyth University have a long history, going back more than 100 years to the formation of the Welsh plant breeding station under the leadership of George Stapleton. Germinal's relationship with IBERS goes back some 35 years, and since the beginning of last year, the breeding programs have been under the direct management of Germinal. Now, it shouldn't come as too big of a surprise that nitrogen fixation has been receiving a lot of interest in recent months. Nitrogen fixation is a biological process carried out by symbiotic bacteria that live in specialized structures on legume roots called root nodules. They take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into ammonia that's then taken up by the plant. Clovers can fix between 100 and 380 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, but this is very dependent on soil conditions, the fixation potential of native rhizobia and their compatibility with the clover. The bulk of fixed nitrogen is used by the legume, with some being transferred to companion grasses. With animal returns, there is ample nitrogen available for grass at higher levels of nitrogen fixation, even when high productivity is required. This is important because it is technically possible to replace the vast amounts of nitrogen fertilizer that apply to UK grasslands with clover fixed nitrogen, which could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by more than 1.4 million tonnes of CO2 equivalents per year, saving UK farmers at current fertilizer prices nearly £1 billion a year. The barrier to this is getting higher nitrogen fixation rates reliably. For this purpose, we're breeding clovers for higher nitrogen fixation potential and screening for compatible elite rhizobia strains that can compete with native rhizobia. It should be noted that the potential of clover to fix nitrogen has not been lost on the arable sector, and demand for clover seed is soaring. A major contributor to global warming is in carbon release from swards during ploughing when reseeding. Grasslands sequester a huge amount of carbon, and while this lost carbon is rapidly reabsorbed when the newly reseeded sward establishes, reducing this flux by ploughing less frequently can substantially reduce the global warming potential of grassland agriculture. One approach to achieve this with perennial grassland species is to use more persistent varieties. Older varieties of red clover, for example, have a lifespan of around 2 years, after which you would traditionally plough it in and resow elsewhere. Newer types like Aber Claret have a lifespan of 5 years. We're further improving this by breeding for disease and pest resistance, particularly crown rot and stem eelworm. We're also in the process of developing novel seed technologies using seed coatings and osmopriming to improve and speed up the establishment of directly drilled seed, removing the need to plough before reseeding. Another area where we are reducing the carbon footprint of fertilizer application is in improving phosphorus use efficiency of white clover. As you're no doubt aware, legumes are notoriously phosphorus hungry. Phosphorus is a limited resource with a significant carbon footprint associated with mining and production. The need to reduce reliance on mined rock phosphate was underlined at the beginning of 2020. China is the world's biggest exporter of phosphates, around 30% of the world's supply, and the COVID-19 pandemic seriously affected supply. Since then, in the last few months, China has issued export quotas that will reduce supply by 45%. This is a trend that's likely to continue as we have rock phosphate deposits sufficient to last for less than 100 years at current usage rates. We have developed new white clover types that have been bred specifically to thrive under lower phosphorus inputs. These are expected to be submitted to national list approval next year. Geopolitical instabilities of fertilizer production and supply appear to be a problem that's not going to go away anytime soon. Nitrogen fertilizer production is currently highly dependent on Russian natural gas supplies, and potassium production being largely controlled by Belarus. So the more we can do to become self-reliant in this regard, the better. What are sometimes called extreme weather events are becoming more and more common for UK grasslands. Of particular concern are periods of water deficit or drought. We are addressing this in white clover by integrating genetics from a related species, Caucasian clover, which grows in mountainous regions of East Europe through to Central Asia. Caucasian clover has a number of characteristics that make it tolerant of extreme weather events and help it maintain the clover content during a drought event, but it is slow to establish and has poor yield. Hybrids produced between the two species give us the yield of white clover, but with the resilience of Caucasian clover, largely through the introduction of subsurface rhizomes. Aberlasting, our first double root variety, is the only example of a commercially available clover of this type, as it's a very difficult process to hybridize the two species. It's currently our worldwide #1 selling white clover type and can make a real difference in maintaining nitrogen fixation during and following periods of drought. Slightly off the wall approach we're taking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from grassland agriculture is to develop grazing tolerant red clovers that have the same growth habits as white clover. The reason for this is that red clover contains an enzyme called polyphenol oxidase, PPO, that catalyzes the production of quinones in the red clover leaves during grazing. These bind to proteins, making them unavailable to rumen microflora, allowing the proteins to pass through to the ruminant's gut when it is digested by where it is digested by the animal rather than being lost as ammonia. It also protects polyunsaturated fatty acids from biohydrogenation, allowing more of them to be incorporated into meat and dairy products, giving healthier products. Bird's-foot trefoil, or lotus, is one of those forage legumes that look great on paper but frequently fail to make an impact in real-world settings, particularly on productive swards. They are nitrogen-fixing, and the leaves contain tannins that impart a number of desirable characteristics to the plant. They can reduce methane production in the rumen by up to 30%. They have a protein protection effect similar to the PPO in red clovers. They're non-bloating and have an anti-parasitic effect on ruminants. The problem with currently available varieties is that they usually fail to make much of an impact on the sward and cannot compete with typical companion species. New lines being bred by Germinal turn this on its head, with persistency and yields more similar to what you would expect from white clover. This is very much one to be looking out for in coming years. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention and we'll pass back to Paul Billings.
Thank you, David. That was a really interesting presentation. Can I confirm one of the points you made in there about the uptake of clover seed on farm, both on forage uses on livestock farms, but also for bycropping on arable farms? Over the last, I suppose, 5 years, I would say we've seen a 50% increase in demand for forage for either white clover or red clover for those two purposes, which is excellent. I do have a question for you, David, that's coming in on the chat, if you're able to ask it. I think it's an extremely interesting question. We all know that clovers can fix nitrogen, and that's brilliant. They fix it for themselves and they also fix it for companion plants. But can we improve that? Can we actually get the soil bacteria and the rhizobia that are in the soil to interact better with clovers to actually fix more nitrogen?
Yes, it's something we are looking at the moment. Screening rhizobia collections that have been collected over the last 50 years or so, and are held in collections at IBERS, and really sort of trying to find out whether there are specific rhizobial strains that will interact better with clovers, different clover types, and that can have a higher nitrogen fixation potential.
Brilliant. Well, that obviously would be a great improvement and a great step forward. Thank you, David. As I say, that was really interesting, and I thank you for your presentation. Our next speaker is Professor John Morby. John is Chair in Livestock Science at Aberystwyth University. He's also the university's Director of Sustainable Farming Systems and IBER's Director of International Research. His research interests include the use of forages for improved livestock production, protein intake and its impacts on productivity of ruminant animals, dietary manipulation to reduce methane emissions, sustainable intensification of forage-based production systems, improvements of forages for improved farmer livelihoods. And alongside all of that, John is also a dairy nutritionist. John, over to you. John, you're on mute. Brilliant.
There we are. Can you hear me now? Sorry, apologies for that. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your introduction, Paul. As Paul has said, I'm going to talk a little bit about dairy cow and ruminant nutrition and how ruminants can contribute to food production for humans and how we might be able to manipulate the diets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from those animals.
John, you've gone on mute again. Don't ask me why.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Oh, all right. Okay. Tell me if I go on mute. Sorry. Quick overview then. Cows and other ruminants, as Paul has said before, are good at converting things that we cannot eat into things that we can eat. The UK is covered in a lot of grassland, which clearly is not very good for humans to eat. But other things like ruminants, sheep, cows, beef cattle, and other ruminant animals can convert those into meat and milk, which are very high quality proteins and foods for human consumption. See if I can change the slide without muting myself again. There we are. Is that still okay? Right.
Yeah.
The issue is that ruminant animals do contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. Clearly, it's very well known that ruminant animals produce a lot of methane. It's often quoted in the press that we have a lot of farting cows. That always bugs me because cows don't fart. Horses fart, but cows burp. The reason for that is the amount of methane that they produce comes from the fermentation of feeds that they consume in their rumens. They not only produce methane, but they also contribute to other pollutant products like nitrous oxide and other potent greenhouse gas, and also to ammonia, which is becoming more coming to the fore of our minds in terms of pollutant emissions, and also nitrates, which contribute to watercourse pollution unless something is done about it. So where does methane come from? Methane obviously comes from feed. It's the fermentation of that food in the rumen of the animals. And the graph on the left here shows how, as digestible feed intake increases, enteric methane, so that's the methane that comes from the gut, increases as well. And at the bottom you can see that's a fairly simple relationship there, or fairly simple equation. It's the hydrogen that's produced as a byproduct of fermentation that reacts with carbon dioxide in the gut to produce methane and water. So the pathway on the right here is looks complicated, but it's a relatively simple representation of the biochemical pathways within the rumen. At the top you've got various products such as cellulose, starch, sugars. Those get degraded by rumen microbes, and there's a production of hydrogen, as I say, as a byproduct, and it's that hydrogen that contributes to the production of methane. But it's that fermentation process that is very important for us as the consumers of ruminant products, because it's the microbes, the symbiotic microbes in the gut of the animal, that allows the animal to consume and use fibers such as cellulose that we cannot use ourselves without putting them through another system, like the rumen of the animal and the production of meat and milk. So an increase on digestibility improves the productivity of animals. So as you increase the digestibility of a diet, it improves productivity, improves the amount of milk or meat that an animal produces, but it does also contribute to an increase in methane emissions. One thing to consider, though, is it's not just the grams per day production of methane that we need to be worried about, but it's what we call the emissions intensity, and that is the amount of methane or other pollutant product that is produced per unit of productivity. So the graph on the left here, left of the screen, shows that on the y-axis is methane per unit of milk energy. So that's what we call the emissions intensity. And you can see there that as milk yield increases, this is from dairy cows, of course, as milk yield increases, the emissions intensity decreases. So what, in this case, a low methane emissions intensity is a good thing. What this graph shows actually are a number of points. Many points actually come from a rather large database of methane emissions from dairy cows collected over the course of many years that were gathered together in a project a few years ago looking at methane emissions from ruminant livestock. The outcome of this is really that it demonstrates that high-yielding cows are more efficient. So you get lower greenhouse gas emissions from high-yielding cows and lower methane emissions intensity from those high-yielding cows. And the same is actually true for production of beef from beef cattle. It's not just methane, though, as I indicated before, that's of relevance to us. It's also the amount of nitrogen that the animal excretes. One of the things that I've been doing for many years is looking at how we can improve the efficiency of use of feed nitrogen for milk protein production. And the converse of that, how can we reduce the amount of feed protein that's excreted as a waste product into the environment? On average, about 75% of nitrogen that is consumed by a dairy cow, in this case, is wasted. That's because about only 25% of the feed nitrogen comes out as milk protein. A large proportion, the other 75% of the feed protein that's consumed, comes out either in urine nitrogen or in feces nitrogen. It's the urine nitrogen that contributes to nitrous oxide emissions, particularly from grazing ruminants, and it's those urine patches that animals deposit on the ground that contributes to nitrous oxide emissions from those grazing animals. So if we can reduce the amount of nitrogen that's excreted in urine, in particular in grazing animals, that's how we can reduce the amount of nitrous oxide that's produced by those animals when they're out on fields. This graph on the left shows in a diagrammatic way how the rumen is a control point for the efficiency of protein use in dairy cows. On the y-axis, we've got a representation of the fermentation rate, and the solid line there represents the release of dietary nitrogen, dietary proteins after animals have consumed it over time. So time zero there would be when the animals have consumed a meal or a bolus of feed. And during the breakdown within the rumen, nitrogen from forage proteins tends to be made available relatively quickly by rumen microbes. However, if they're using fibers, which, as I said before, is one of the benefits of ruminant animals, fiber degradation in the rumen tends to happen relatively slowly, and so therefore you can get an imbalance in the availability of energy in the rumen, which reduces the availability or the ability of microbes to grow and produce that microbial protein, which David mentioned is what actually then goes on to feed the animal. Anything that's degraded within the rumen but not captured as microbial protein tends to get absorbed as ammonia, as you can see there in the graph. That gets absorbed by ammonia into the animal, that gets converted to urea by the liver and is excreted in urine. And it's that urea that's excreted in urine and a little bit in milk that contributes to, well, it's excreted and contributes to the production of nitrous oxide and ammonia and also nitrates that are deposited on the land, in the soil. As Paul and David have said, forages are very good for livestock feeds. Those that we've been looking at for many years, as David mentioned, are perennial ryegrass in particular, ryegrass and fescue hybrids, festuloleums and clovers. We've been looking at those both in terms of fresh forages which are grazed, but also ensiled forages, so production of silage from ryegrass, from clovers, or as combinations of those that are mixed and ensiled together. Coming back to the graph in terms of fermentation rate and availability of energy and nitrogen in the rumen, to improve the efficiency of rumen protein use, one way of doing that is to increase the availability of energy quickly to match the availability of protein that's produced by the degradation of forage proteins. One quickly available source of energy is water-soluble carbohydrates, and the figure here on the right shows the proportions of different water-soluble carbohydrates, WSE, sorry, in grasses. There are two graphs here, two bars here. One is a high WSE ryegrass. This is a ryegrass that's been bred to express a high concentration of WSE compared to a control ryegrass. And you can see here that up to 80% or over 80% of those WSEs can be available as fructans, and this is a polymer of fructose It's a storage carbohydrate of grasses, which is soluble in water, unlike storage carbohydrate of, for example, cereals or potatoes, which is there as starch. We spent quite a few years looking at the effect of feeding these high water-soluble carbohydrate grasses, so-called high sugar grasses, HSGs, when feeding them to dairy cows, also to sheep and beef animals. But this graph here shows a number of experiments where we've looked at the partitioning of dietary protein, dietary nitrogen, into milk protein, and urine nitrogen. The graph on there shows on the y-axis the output of nitrogen as a proportion of nitrogen intake. That's output of nitrogen in urine and in milk. So that's secretion of milk protein. That's the bars with the creamy color, and the yellow bars are the outputs of nitrogen in urine. And almost every time, not every time, but almost every time, which is highlighted by these blue boxes, shows that when you feed a grass which has been bred to express a high concentration of water-soluble carbohydrates, you tend to get a reduction, a lower proportion of feed nitrogen being excreted in urine. And in many cases, you also get an increase, a concomitant increase in the amount of feed nitrogen that is secreted as milk protein. So these high sugar grasses have been shown, either alone or in combination, when fed in combination with clovers, to either to increase milk yields, not always, but they can increase milk yields. They tend to also reduce the excretion of nitrogen in urine, and doing that reduces the amount of nitrous oxide that will be emitted by the soils from urine patches when animals are grazing. So what is this high sugar grass, or what is the WSC doing in nitrogen? This graph here shows the again on the y-axis, it's the amount of urine that's excreted as a proportion of feed nitrogen consumed, and on the x-axis we've got the ratio of dietary water-soluble carbohydrates to nitrogen. So as you increase the concentration of WSC, or increase the ratio of WSC in the diet to nitrogen, you get a decrease in the amount of water-soluble, you get a decrease in the excretion of urinary nitrogen to a point, and that point is up to about a ratio of about 9. And beyond that, I think what's happening is that as you increase the amount of WSC in the diet, you just run out, the rumen microbes run out of nitrogen. So this concentration, or this ratio of WSC, tends to be, well, equates to roughly 25 to 30% of WSC in the diet of an animal, which is where we tend to see WSCs in swards which are being grazed by WSC concentrations being grazed by ruminant animals. By choosing swards with high sugar grasses in them, it allows us to balance the energy and protein in the diet of the animal. This is something that can be done when animals are fed silages or fed diets which are being mixed and fed to them as a complete diet, but it's very difficult to do in a fresh pasture unless there is a choice of swards or choice of grass varieties which allows us to do this. So balancing the diet, energy and protein can, as I've shown previously, can increase milk yields, but it also can reduce nitrogen excretion, and that reduces greenhouse gas emissions from those animals. Another area which is well known to reduce methane emissions from ruminants is the dietary oil or dietary fat concentration. Dietary fat can reduce methanogenesis in the rumen of the animal. Part of the reason part of the way that happens is there's biohydrogenation of fatty acids, of unsaturated fatty acids, using some of that hydrogen that's produced during fermentation of forages. Fresh forages are relatively high in unsaturated fatty acids. This is a good thing in terms of the product they produce, because it produces meat and milk with a good fatty acid profile. Animals which are grass-fed, particularly on fresh grass, tend to have a fatty acid profile which is high in unsaturated fatty acids, and they also tend to have a relatively high concentration of CLA, which may contribute to human health. The graph on the right shows that on the y-axis, enteric methane emissions increasing as you go up there, but also it just represents the dietary fat content. So as you increase the fat content of the diet, you tend to get a reduction in methane emissions up to a point, after which you get a significant drop-off. And that drop-off is when the high concentrations or higher concentrations of fat become toxic to rumen microbes. And when that happens, if you're not careful, in the diet that's presented to animals, a reduction, toxicity of rumen microbes and a reduction in fermentation is clearly not a good thing, because that will reduce the amount of fermentation of those fibers that ruminant animals can use that we can't. So dietary fat content of up to about 6% of free fatty or free fats, free oils is about what we would recommend, the recommended levels. The graph that I've just shown here is shows a diurnal variation on the x-axis. It's the time of day from about 7 in the morning to 7 at night, and on the y-axis is the water-soluble carbohydrate content of grasses of 2 different varieties, Aberavon and Aberdart. As the day progresses, the plants photosynthesize, and the products of that photosynthesis get incorporated into the water-soluble carbohydrate content of the grass, so it increases during the day. Similar thing happens with the fat content as well. So the time of day can influence in the fatty acid concentration in the dry matter of grasses, because the products of photosynthesis also contribute to fatty acid content of the grass. So changes in diurnal variation in fatty acid contents can improve or can influence the amount of methane that animals produce when grazing those grasses. We've been working at Aberystwyth to look at the lipid content of grasses. Lipids obviously have a fairly high energy density compared to carbohydrates. As I've said, an unsaturated fatty acid profile or content of grasses is a good thing in terms of ruminant products. They have potential to reduce enteric methane emissions, as I've just described. The graph here on the bottom left shows some in vitro work, some work we did in the lab where we looked at the concentration of fatty acids on the x-axis compared to the amount of methane that was produced per gram of dry matter that was incubated. This is ryegrass that was incubated in rumen fluid in the lab, and it shows as the concentration of fatty acid increases, the amount of methane that is produced from that material decreases. The same sort of thing that you'd find when actually fed in vivo to the live animal. On the right, it shows that there's, on the x-axis, a number of, well, hundreds of different breeding lines that my colleagues in the plant breeding program have been looking at, and the fatty acid content of the dry matter. It shows considerable variation, varying between 20 grams per kilogram, or about 2% of the dry matter, up to about 5% of the dry matter. If you recall a few minutes ago, I mentioned that about 6% of the dry matter is about where we would want to get to in terms of total oil content. So we do need to be a little bit careful that some of these grasses do not become too high in the amount of oils that they contain when grazing when grazed by animals. But it shows that there is significant potential here to breed grasses which can contribute to a reduction in methane emission from animals that are grazing those swards. What things are we thinking about for the future in terms of grazing animals? Grazing livestock are clearly very important for milk production. I've just mentioned the high lipid and high sugar ryegrasses that we've been looking at over the last couple of decades, really, in Aberystwyth. We also need to consider water stress tolerance. So that's not just drought, but also flooding events. There's plenty, even just in the last year, there's been a lot of in the news about drought conditions in the UK, and certainly even in Wales and Pembrokeshire. It's not something that you'd expect to have seen, but it is happening as a result of climate change. David mentioned breeding of forages to become more efficient in phosphorus, but also more efficient in nitrogen. Fertilizer prices this year are 4 times what they were last year even. We need grasses which grow well with lower additions of fertilizer nitrogen, or even without fertilizer nitrogen, by combining them with clovers and other legumes. There's opportunities to improve fatty acid profiles, to improve the composition of products from animals which have fed these grasses. One thing that I haven't mentioned at all is the amino acid balance. And amino acids are those compounds that make up the proteins. Those contribute to how efficient proteins are used by livestock for producing meat and milk. There may be ways of influencing the amino acid balance of forages to make them even more efficiently used by animals that consume them. And then lastly, David again mentioned other secondary compounds such as tannins, saponins, polyphenol oxidase. Reading these, looking at these in forages which are consumed by animals, these can be used to improve the efficiency of use of these products for better milk and meat production. So in summary, as I've said, ruminant animals are very good at converting things that we can't eat, so that's grasses and other fibers, into things that we can eat. We have to recognise that ruminant agriculture does contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, to nitrous oxide and methane emissions. However, there are plenty of options to minimise how those emissions are produced and how we can increase the sustainability of livestock production, not just in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of the use of other resources. The grassland that Paul mentioned earlier in this session. Precise diet formulation is important. It's very easy, relatively easy, to formulate a diet that can be used efficiently by animals when they're indoors. Much more difficult to formulate a diet which is available to grazing ruminants. But the choice of grazing materials for the choice of appropriate grass varieties and species allows us as producers to produce healthy products for human consumption from productive animals, which are useful in terms of what they can do to produce meat and milk. But we do, as I say, we do have to recognise that we need to try and minimise their environmental impact as a result of what they're doing. So very lastly, thank you very much for listening, but I just want to acknowledge the funding that we've had over the years from Germinal and from many other funders as presented here on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was fascinating. Who could believe that the humble grass plant could actually do so much? And the humble legume plant, David, sorry. I think one of the strengths that you have at Aberystwyth is, John, yourself as an animal nutritionist, and David, yourself as a plant breeder, working together. And I think that is one of the real things we need to do going forward, is to bring animal scientists and plant scientists together. It's animals that are converting plants to human products, and linking those two things together is absolutely vitally important. We are a bit tight on time, but I've got a couple of questions coming I want to run to you, John. You will be unsurprised to hear that they are to do with emissions, mostly. So the first one is, how does the emission intensity, which we spoke about at quite length near the beginning of the speech, and I found fascinating, how does that emission intensity relate to absolute emissions? Do they stay the same regardless of yield?
Absolute emissions, well, the graph that I showed is, as you increase intake, you tend to get an increase in emission. You get an increase in emission in terms of grams per day of methane, but you also get an increase in productivity of the animal. If you so a more highly productive animal tends to have a lower emission intensity. If you have struggling to think how to phrase this, but basically, if you're looking at a fixed amount of milk production, if you can have fewer, more highly productive animals, which overall reduce the amount of methane produced by a herd, for a fixed milk yield compared to more animals that are lower yielding but have a higher emissions intensity. So there are two different ways of looking at it. As you say, grams per day methane production or grams per kilogram of milk production. If you can have fewer high yielding animals which overall produce less methane but the same amount of milk, or more lower yielding animals that produce the same amount of milk but overall the greater quantities of methane. I'm not sure I've really answered your question there.
But you've sparked a debate that I'm going to have next time I see you, John. We'll put it that way. I've got one more for you. If you could answer quite quickly, that'd be good. Again, it's one I'm probably going to take up with you later. But can we manipulate amino acid balance in order to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions?
Manipulate amino acid balance to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions? I don't know the answer to that one.
That's one for breeders.
Yeah.
Breeders to do.
Can we manipulate amino acid balance? That's one thing. Does it contribute to greenhouse gas emissions? That's another one. I think in terms of improving the efficiency of use of proteins by improving the amino acid balance, that would reduce the amount of nitrogen that's excreted by reducing the amount of those amino acids that can't be used, which would therefore should reduce the amount of nitrous oxide that's produced. So yes, if we can breed a grass that has a better balance of amino acids for production of milk protein, that should reduce the amount of nitrogen that's excreted and therefore reduce nitrous oxide emissions. So we're not talking about methane necessarily, I don't think, but certainly the amount of nitrogen that contributes to nitrous oxide emissions and also to ammonia emissions. Good.
John and David, as our two speakers, we are short on time, but there are a number of questions in the Q&A. Whilst Christina is talking in a minute, could you answer those questions for them in the Q&A, the ones we haven't already addressed, and give a comment so people do get some feedback, and that would be great. I'm now going to hand this session over to Dr. Christina Marley. Christina is Reader of Sustainable Grassland Systems and Agri-Foods at IVAS. Her research institutes include optimization of nutrient use from soil to animal products within ruminant livestock systems to reduce the reliance on imported feeds and fertilizers and the use of nutrition to improve animal health. Christina is going to run the remainder of our session, and what she's going to do is seek your ideas. You've had some from us, but seek your ideas on what we can do to reduce emissions from productive grassland and also give you some feedback. So thank you very much for your time. I will now hand over to Christina.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our workshop today. So as Paul said, for this next part, we're going to do an interactive session with yourselves. And as part of this, we'll be looking at VVox. So you can access this, as you can see on your screen. You can either join online via vvox.app and typing in the PIN number that you can see there, or I'm going to say the easier way for those of us that might find it easier. You can use the QR code and that will take you straight into this VVox poll. Now, I'm told we do have a bit of a time delay between the live and the actual VVox, so we're going to just see how this goes this morning. And I will get a sense of how many people are up. I'll just give you a few moments to find your way onto that. So just to reassure everybody, this poll is totally anonymous and it will be used to provide feedback in terms of the outputs from this session towards COP27 planning. Can everybody see that screen? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we're going to start off with hopefully a nice warm-up question for you. What is your role? Okay, thank you. And now we're going to go into something in terms of grassland production. So I must obviously stress that this poll is focusing on productive grasslands, and this question is how to rank in priority order the following grassland production goals. I'm not going to read out your three options for you. Give you a bit of time to do that. You can see there's still a couple of people still thinking, so I'm just going to give you a bit more time. Okay. I shall move on to question 3. So for question 3, now you've had a nice warm up in ranking 3 things, we give you a few more to do. So please rank in priority order what you feel are the actions that farmers can take to reduce emissions today whilst maintaining profitable grassland production. Afraid we don't have prizes for fastest fingers first on this today. Okay, there's a few of you still to reply, so I'll just give you 1 more minute. Okay, and we're moving on to question 4. Rank in priority order which of the following areas of research are needed to help grassland farming achieve net zero. Just a few more to come, so I'll just give you 1 more minute on this. Okay, I'll close that now, move on to question 5. So for question 5, what key theme would you like to see at COP27 to help grassland farming achieve net zero? I've given an example here, please don't be steered by it, but just to help get the brain cogs working, it could be perhaps the role of grassland, productive grasslands to deliver carbon neutral food and farming. But please come up with your own, otherwise it will look too obvious. I think this is the harder question, where you have to think of the landscape of UK agriculture by 2027. I should say global agriculture as well. Okay, so there's just a couple more people to reply. I'll just give you 1 more minute here. Remember, this is our opportunity to shape COP27. Okay, brilliant, thank you. Okay, so those 5 questions are going to go back to as feedback from this workshop. It's an excellent way of collating your thoughts in this topic. But for the final question here, as Paul alluded to at the start of this workshop, you have an opportunity now to use one word only that you would highlight as a key area for COP27, that COP27 should prioritise to help grassland farming achieve net zero. And we can have a little bit of fun with this because I can make it interactive so you can actually see the results as they come in. So please feel free to add your words. How has somebody managed to get that as one word? And we'll see what the word cloud looks like at the end.
Hi, Christina, you can use up to 20 characters, but it doesn't have to be one word.
Ah, okay. Even better. Thank you. That's brilliant. Somebody's even managed to get an arrow in the front of carbon legumes. So I think that is a really nice summary there. Thank you. I think the use of use legumes is definitely coming forward as a key message from here, with lots of other nice regenerative carbon sequestration. Oh, it's still going. But thank you. That's a really yeah, I'm just so impressed with these word clouds. We could stay here probably for the rest of the morning and play with this, but I know that we are set to finish at 11 o'clock. So at 2 minutes to, all that remains for me to say is thank you very much to everybody for your participation today. I'd like to very much thank our speakers, Dr. David Lloyd, Professor John Morby, and I'd also like to thank our two brilliant organisers, Nat and Vicky, and thank you very much to Paul for co-hosting this with myself today. Thank you, and we'll look forward to seeing you all soon.